opposition to international banks and economic globalization. In reaction, one of the major items on the Bilderberger agenda was the role of liberals in various organizations. Also on the docket, the separatist movement in Canada, how fragmented Canadian provinces could be absorbed into the United States. Next, the expansion of NAFTA from Alaska to Chile, to boost corporate profits by encouraging American businesses to move to Latin American countries, where the costs of labor are low and environmental laws are not enforced. Do organizations like the Bilderbergers, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Federal Reserve pull the strings of our lives like master puppeteers? Or are such ideas merely the paranoid ravings of conspiracy theorists?
The people who call conspiracy theorists are not the conspiracy theorists themselves. We're talking about facts here. The Bilderberg Group does exist. The Federal Reserve does exist. The people who are members of the Bilderberg Group are also the people who do control the Federal Reserve. These are all facts.
David Rockefeller himself thanked the media for keeping this all hushed up. If it wouldn't have been for you, then we wouldn't have been able to pursue our interests towards internationalism. They're conspiring to eliminate the United States as we know it through something as simple as the elimination of our national identity.
Why is it the major media would deny this? Let's look at the ownership of the major media. Let's look at the roster of, say, the Bilderberg meeting. Katharine Graham owns the Washington Post. Katharine Graham has been to the Bilderbergers. Conrad Black, one of the largest media barons in Canada and Europe, has not only been to these meetings, but he has hosted the meeting just a few years ago.
Every year they meet in secret, and there is an absolute news blackout. There is never anything reported in any of those papers.
In this country, the press is seen as the fourth estate. You know, you've got the judiciary branch, the legislative branch of government, the executive branch of government. Then you're supposed to have the press keeping an eye on these three. If leaders from these three are working with other leaders around the world to determine economic policy, wars, human rights, etc., then yes, the press has a responsibility to get in there and to inform people. But just 2 years ago, I think 1997, the First Lady attended the meeting in Georgia. A few papers in Georgia picked it up, but this is the First Lady at a meeting with people who arguably want to rule the world. You know, that should have been front page news.
Well, the fifth estate are the international bankers, and they just couldn't accomplish their goals without being to control the electronic media. Now, what they hate more than anything else is this outbreak amongst the internet, cable TV, radio talk shows. That's what they can't control. They need control, and without it, they aren't going to get what they want.
Of course, one person's sinister conspiracy could just be another person's private affair.
The Bilderberg is a clubby atmosphere. That's what it is, really. It's a clubby affair. By invitation only.
Now, when you see groups like Council on Foreign Relations, Bilderbergers, Trilateral Commission, you have to remember bankers work internationally, and the central banks in all countries work together, and they do this through special groups. They formed the Council on Foreign Relations at the Versailles Peace Conference after World War I. Now, many conservatives believe the CFR runs in the United States, but it only does it secondhand because the real orders come out of London first.
Decisions arrived at in secret Bilderberger meetings apparently do affect our lives as much, if not more, than the policies adopted through Democrat-Republican squabbling. When no other newspaper bothered, the tiny Washington publication, The Spotlight, single-handedly invaded the shroud obscuring these secret gatherings.
Well, by penetrating the secrecy of Bilderberg, we were able to do an advanced story on the end of the Cold War, the downfall of Maggie Thatcher, an advanced story on the Persian Gulf War, then President George Bush's reversal from his read my lips, no new taxes pledge.
The financial entities that dominate the Federal Reserve, the Bilderberg Group, are largely centered around the Rockefeller family and the Rothschild family. Names such as Chase Manhattan, Citibank, all these groups that move in the Rockefeller sphere of influence and the Rothschild sphere of influence are the glue that hold the Bilderberg elite together.
Most troubling of all is evidence that the attendees of these secret meetings may even choose our presidents.
In December of 1974, there was a major headline on the editorial page of the Atlanta Constitution that said Jimmy Carter is running for what? And the what was about this today. Running American president.
Jimmy Carter had been a one-term governor of Georgia, hardly known to the American people. He, however, had an entree into the international elite through his membership in David Rockefeller's Trilateral Commission. No one had ever heard of Jimmy Carter. I think that's fair to say. Yet, within the next several years, as he announced his presidential campaign, started moving towards a Democratic presidential nomination, he started getting a lot of favorable media coverage, particularly from media connected to the Rockefeller sphere of influence. Jimmy Carter was painted as a populist, a man of the people.
I remember when we couldn't find a microphone.
When in fact he was moving in the highest circles of the international elite.
When we discovered that the obscure governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton, had attended his first Bilderberg meeting in Baden-Baden, Germany in 1991, we were able to anticipate a political future for the young man.
When I discovered in 1991 that Bill Clinton had attended the Bilderberg meeting, I was able to predict that he would be the candidate for the presidency of the Democratic Party. I didn't think he'd be elected president, incidentally. And so they picked him. The Bilderbergers actually picked him to be the president.
And will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Bill Clinton, like Jimmy Carter, was a product of the Rockefeller Empire. Bill Clinton has a few up on Jimmy Carter, though. Not only was Clinton a member of the Trilateral Commission, but he was also invited to become a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He had the imprimatur of the Rockefeller and Rothschild families.
Well, you know, I grew up like everybody, every other kid in the United States, thinking, President of the United States, most powerful man in the world. But it's just not the case. You know, even Bill Clinton has admitted that he is only a virtual president anymore. That was in a speech in September of 1998.
Just when you think the economy's stable, just when you think you're made in the shade, someone changes the route.
Is there a conspiracy? If we are onto the fomenters of what's loosely called the New World Order, the free movement of capital and goods across national boundaries is clearly a big part of their agenda.
The global elite have been the primary promoters of free trade precisely because of the fact that they are the ones who control the major multinational corporations. They are the ones who want to build televisions in Mexico and in impoverished third world countries and pay these people sub-minimum wages, slave wages, and then export them at gigantic profits back to the United States. But we're told by the major media in this country, which is tied in again with these international elites, that, oh, well, this is a temporary thing. It really is good for America. But it's not good for America. Look at anybody who's lost their job. Look at how their family suffers. That's the Bilderberg group at work. That's the Trilateral Commission. That's the Federal Reserve. All these elite groups that they're benefiting, but the average American isn't.
These families have been mostly in the banking business for at least 500 years, most of them. They were in the slave trade. They were in the opium trade. These people are not interested in 5% a year return. They want 1,000% a year return. And to get into those things, you need to get into gold, slaves, drugs. That's where the big money is.
Fiat currency is what we have. Fiat, meaning no thing, nothing, having no value. In other words, it's backed by the faith and credit of the person who is creating the money. If you have a private bank out here that is creating this money, then your faith is in their ability to keep the value of this currency to where everybody accepts it. We have to understand that people, not governments, not central banks, nor nation states, but people ultimately determine what money is and what money is not. It's been that way for over 5,000 years.
This brings us back to our initial question. Are we citizens of a great democracy, or is something more convoluted and sinister at work? Is there anything wrong with the best and the brightest controlling our country, or potentially in the near future the entire world? Are international financiers in control of our lives? Are they masters of the universe?
What's wrong with an elite ordering world events? There's a lot of things wrong with that. The American people, at least, have always been told that they control their own destiny through their elected representatives, but when you find their elected representatives behind closed doors, surrounded by armed guards who will not let the general public in, and they're making decisions that affect the future of the American people and the people of the world, then there are legitimate questions as to why this elite should be able to dictate things.
The whole point of one world government is to eliminate the concept of nationalism. Now, why is eliminating nationalism bad if it would eliminate war? Well, the reason is, if old British Lord Acton's axiom, that is, absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely.
If you could print $1 billion tomorrow, well, you could be a master of the universe. But you can't, because they have the monopoly. As long as they can print the money, as long as they can buy the New York Times, the Washington Post, congressmen, senators, presidents, then you can't compete against them. What have you got to offer?
If you have relatively few people governing your government, you don't have a democratic government, do you? You've got a secret cabal here who is governing the United States. And not just the United States, but the governments of England and France, Germany, all the European countries, less influence in Japan, but quite a bit there too. So it's a conspiracy against the people of the United States and of the Western world. What would you call it?
Are the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds and the people in their sphere of influence the masters of the universe? Let's put it this way. They want to be the masters of the universe, but there are a lot of people who don't want them to be.
They create money out of nothing. What a scam. They have so much money, they don't care about money. All they care about is power. All they care about is being able to control the political situation so it goes their way. But they still have not been able to succeed in America because of the wealth and the independence and the patriotic spirit of the American middle class. That's the only thing that's holding this world from a situation of total despotism.
See, if I serve you a black cup of coffee and it's 95% coffee but 5% arsenic, it's mostly coffee, but it's going to kill you in the end. What we've been doing is we've been getting a truth-error mixture of events going on around the world. Enough truth to make it seem plausible, but enough error to get you off course. A lot of it has to do with our educational systems, where we've been dumbing our kids down. And when you dumb them down, it's the cruelest form of censorship, because most of this current generation can't even read the books that these guys would be scared of.
It's only fitting that we end with a quote from the man who started it all, Woodrow Wilson, a dreamer who tried to change the world for the better, but who in his final years ended up regretting many of the important accomplishments attributed to his presidency. We are controlled by a small group of dominant men, he said, of the worst ruled and most completely controlled governments in the civilized world. Is there a sinister conspiracy in control of our lives? Are there masters of the universe? If there are, I'm not one of them, nor would I want to be. Democratic societies have always been the crowning glory of human civilization, and in a democracy, the people decide. They don't have their decisions made for them. Masters of the universe, you've seen the evidence, you decide.
Just when you think that your
laws are not enforced. Do organizations like the Bilderbergers, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Federal Reserve pull the strings of our lives like master puppeteers? Or are such ideas merely the paranoid ravings of conspiracy theorists?
The people who call conspiracy theorists are not the conspiracy theorists themselves. We're talking about facts here. The Bilderberg Group does exist. The Federal Reserve does exist. The people who are
opposition to international banks and economic globalization. In reaction, one of the major items on the Bilderberger agenda was the role of liberals in various organizations. Also on the docket, the separatist movement in Canada. how fragmented Canadian provinces could be absorbed into the United States. Next, the expansion of NAFTA from Alaska to Chile, to boost corporate profits by encouraging American businesses to move to Latin American countries, where the costs of labor are low and environmental.
Major media. Let's look at the roster of, say, the Bilderberg meeting. Katharine Graham owns the Washington Post. Katharine Graham has been to the Bilderbergers. Conrad Black, one of the largest media barons in Canada and Europe, has not only been to these meetings, but he has hosted the meeting just a few years ago.
Every year they meet in secret, and there is an absolute news blackout. There is never anything reported in any of those papers.
In this country, the press is seen as the fourth estate. You know, you've got the judiciary branch, the legislative branch of government, the executive branch of government. Then you're supposed to have the press keeping an eye on these three. If leaders from these three are working with other leaders around the world to determine economic policy, wars, human rights, etc., then yes, the press has a responsibility to get in there and to inform people. But just 2 years ago, I think 1996...
Members of the Bilderberg Group are also the people who do control the Federal Reserve. These are all facts.
David Rockefeller himself thanked the media for keeping this all hushed up. If it wouldn't have been for you, then we wouldn't have been able to pursue our interests towards internationalism. They're conspiring to eliminate the United States as we know it through something as simple as the elimination of our national identity.
Why is it the major media would deny this? Let's look at the ownership of